Hello, I'm Mary Phaeton. Welcome to Cover to Cover. On this program we meet the authors of the latest West Australian books. The show is presented by Writing WA, the peak body for writing and related activities in Western Australia. Today we're discussing Stepping Off, Rewilding and Belonging in the Southwest by Thomas M. Wilson. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Mary.
Now, I want to start with the end almost. At the beginning of the afterword has a quote, and it's from Scott Russell Sanders. It says, "It has taken me half a lifetime of searching to realise that the likeliest path to the ultimate ground leads through my local ground." Tell me what made you want to write a book about the southwest of Western Australia, your place.
Scott Russell Sanders is he's one of my heroes. He's an essayist from North America. And something else he said that really resonated with me is that if I find my spiritual center, it's within my geographical center. So for me, I wanted to communicate what was the nature of Southwest Australia. It's really about most people's experience of Western Australia, but I wanted to talk about what was the nature of the geology, the biology, the evolutionary history, the human relationship with the environment here, and communicate that to a wide audience. But that wasn't just to enrich people's general knowledge of the area. It was something more, and I think if you read the book, you'll find that I, as the author of the book, and many other people, do get a sense of being spiritually grounded by being grounded in a place. Yeah,
which is something that, I mean, a lot has been written about how disconnected we've become from our place as well. And I mean, you talk about the sense of belonging. It doesn't necessarily need to be for people who come from this place to kind of get benefit from this book in terms of understanding that they need to look around their place to really reconnect. Is that what rewilding means?
That's in the title, isn't it? The word rewilding. And people, I think, have recently, someone was telling me just before this interview, they'd seen a short video on the internet on what happened in Yellowstone National Park in North America when they put wolves into that national park, and the way in which putting in apex predators into an ecosystem can have flow-on effects. And in that case, the whole ecosystem, the whole park changed. The number of deers were reduced by the predation of wolves on deer. That had flow-on effects on which tree saplings were allowed to grow beyond being a sapling and not being eaten by the deer when they were saplings. And that had flow-on effects on the rivers and the wood available to beavers and the flow of the rivers. So that's the most famous example of actively rewilding a landscape, and the one that comes to mind most frequently.
Well, talking about the title, what did you mean by stepping off?
Yeah, well, rewilding, but just before we leave that, rewilding in Southwest Australia has a relationship with putting the dingo back into Southwest Australia. But stepping off, I meant stepping off the grid of interconnected communications. It seems like many people are on the television or the smartphone or the laptop a lot of their time, and a lot of the culture they consume is American culture, the American culture machine. So stepping off the grid in the sense of stepping out of the grid of television and communications, stepping off the grid in terms of stepping off the pavement, stepping off paved civilization more generally. And that's something that I did a lot when I was writing the book, and I continue to do and remind myself to do every week, be it just going into Kings Park. We're in the centre of Perth right now, and Kings Park's just behind this studio. And there and Bold Park are places that I both go to step off the grid.
And it has, I mean, this book is partially a personal journey for you, a journey of discovery too, to kind of understand the place that you come from, isn't it? What were some of the discoveries that you made? And for someone who, I mean, your PhD is in environment and literature, so I mean, you already had some knowledge, but what were some of the discoveries that you made writing this book?
We all speak English here, and so the reservoir of literature from the past few hundred years that we have access to is often North American and British. Australian literature has some gems in it. West Australian writing about the natural environment. We don't have a John Muir or a Henry David Thoreau, but we do have some environmental writing. I talk about that to some extent, but I also, so my PhD has been useful in having that background to understand our own history of nature writing. But it's not a big history. A lot of the writing I did for the book was it's a combination of communicating what is the evolutionary history of this place, what's the geological history, what's the social history, and responding in, dare I say, lyrical ways to the place. Sometimes people might accuse me of rhapsodizing about a slope of the Darling Ranges in summer with wandoo trees and the sun slipping through the thin eucalyptus leaves, and so I try to combine scientific communication with what we would consider nature writing. Yeah.
So in other words, you were exploring using that kind of writing on a new space that had never been written about in that way before. Yeah. I'm sure there were lots of reasons for writing this book, but one of the prompts that I liked was your story about author John Fowles, who you had a strong connection with over time, and his reaction to looking at a book about orchids of the Southwest. Tell me that story.
In 2003, I think it was, I was in southwest England in Dorset, and I was researching the unpublished journals of the English writer John Fowles, who's written many well-known post-Second World War novels and essays, as well as some poetry. And I was down in a basement in Exeter Library, and there was a page of one of his unpublished journals I wanted to photocopy, so the librarian got on the phone to John Fowles' agent. Ends up being Sarah Fowles, who was at that point John Fowles' agent, who is also was also his wife before he sadly passed away. And I got on the phone to Sarah, and there I was talking with Sarah Fowles. I was invited to Sunday lunch that coming weekend. Ended up at John Fowles' house, and I remember noticing a kangaroo paw in a small clay pot out just on the edge of his conservatory, in front of a kind of undulating garden running down to the sea, and this beautiful bright red and green flower reminded me of my home. And I knew John had received as a present a book of paintings of orchids of Southwest Australia, and he loved it. I'd actually read in the journal how it had been a kind of a Lilliputian Jonathan Swift style exoticism to him from beyond the seas. And I wanted to have an intelligent conversation with him about West Australian plants, and I realised I couldn't. Years later, after the research for this book, luckily I can.
Yeah. I was captivated by your description quite early in the book of the Southwest as an ecologically meaningful entity, and you kind of went on to describe the borders of it, the proportions, like a medium-sized Western European country, and the mosaic of overlapping regions. Can you paint that picture even to some small extent now?
Yeah, I mean we could start a tour right here in Kings Park, and the brightly held Banksia flower spikes which are often different species will be in flower. Menziei, Banksia menziei, in flower in winter. So they'll flower at different times of year so that they can attract pollinators and not compete directly. We could go north into the Kwongan. We talk about it as heath. We can go up to Moor River. Heath is a European term. Makes you think of Scottish gorse, doesn't it?
Something
Purple
shorter.
and brown.
Yeah.
Very different if you go up to the kind of bird-haunted acacia Kwongan north of, Kwongan being a Noongar word, north of Perth, being a kind of a sandy, arid area with a low scrub-like vegetation. We could go further south. You'd find yourself in Karri forests. You would have left the Swan coastal plain, that area of north-south, often wetlands and deep coastal sand, and you've entered these, the second tallest flowering plant on earth, the Eucalyptus diversicolor forest, the Karri forest, and you've left land which actually has had human footprints for 47,000 years. Yes, there are human footprints in the Karri forest, but the forest there would have had far fewer human families for these 1,000 years. So you've gone further into the wilderness, not just in our modern European conception of wilderness, but even for the first Australians. You could go down to the south coast that we all think of as a kind of coastal boundary of granite and spray. And you could go further northeast into Mallee country, lignotuberous small trees with multi trunk stems. You could go into the wheat belt, an area which is now largely denuded of vegetation, but before I think I've got a chapter of my book. I know I have a chapter of my book on the environmental history of what happened in the wheat belt.
Which used to be called the York Gum Belt, or ought to be.
Well, that's what I was going to get onto. That we refer to that area of the planet as the wheat belt, the West Australian wheat belt, which is kind of a profound ripping off of its ecological identity. And really, we could call it the York Gum Belt because that's its original ecological identity. That's its identity for most of its history. It's just a geological blink in time where we've grown a monoculture of wheat and some sheep.
And when you talk about your kind of borders, kind of Geraldton to Esperance.
Yeah, sorry, I totally digressed.
No, you were
in my
talking
tour
about the
of the
bioregions.
But that's right. When I wrote this book, I remember, because I did a lot of interviews and reading of old colonial books. My grandmother was a West Australian historian, interestingly enough, but she had a lot of old books which I had access to, including W.H. Knight's History of Western Australia, written in the 19th century, and I had this atmospherically crumbling old volume that I leafed my way through. And I remember reading that West Australia was that area divided by Her Majesty's Commission down whichever longitude it was. I won't be able to quote the exact figure, but on either side, if I look at that area where the state of Western Australia is now delineated, I see desert. I don't actually see something deeply meaningful on the land. If an alien arrived from outer space, would they know West Australia has started and they've left the Northern Territory? Probably not.
But you talk about it as being it's almost like it's an island in its own right.
Yeah, so that's it. I'm zeroing down on the southwest, and when I say the southwest, sadly I think most people who will see this book will think of going down on holidays in Margaret River, and I'm referring to the southwest corner of the Australian continent. It could go up to Geraldton and out to Esperance. The line between those 2 points wouldn't be exactly diagonal, but something like that. So it's a large area. And why is it meaningful? It's meaningful because if you go north and east of that line, the rainfall starts to drop off under 300 mils a year.
Yeah.
And really you could start to think of the centre of Australia as a very silent place. because actually life needs water. You can go into the UWA cadaver laboratories. They have fans buzzing because they want a sterile environment. They don't want bacteria growing, so they make sure it's a very cold and dry environment. Life needs water, so the Southwest has water, and it means that species have been here for hundreds of thousands, and in some cases millions of years, evolving on their own unique ecological trajectories, not able to amble across the Nullarbor Plain to the eastern states.
Let's talk about some of the species who haven't been here for that long. And firstly, you've sort of, I guess, paid tribute in this book to what you call the environmental literacy of our First Nations people and the Noongar people of the Southwest particularly. What were some of their skills that have sort of, I guess, been wiped out in a sense by, the settlers coming in and farming the land the way they have? I know fire management was one of them.
That's right. Fire stick farming, which I think, thanks to the work of a few authors, Australians have started to understand that southern Australia was traditionally a park-like environment because of the activities of the first Australians who set fire periodically to the natural vegetation, creating, after the fires had passed and the rains had fallen, lush carpets of grass, which grazing macropods would thrive upon. Kangaroos, there are around 60 different species of macropod. The grey kangaroo, western grey kangaroo, is only one that immediately springs to mind to most Australians. But so they created an environment that was good for the things they wanted to eat. So they were landscape engineers. They changed the look of Australia, and we can look back at cores of old grass trees and see, actually in front of our own eyes, the point in which in the Southwest these fire stick farming regimes were changed, and there are obvious impacts on Aboriginal populations. How many people were here doing that fire stick farming at different points in the 19th century? And so now when you see the bush, actually it's a different bush to the one that some of my ancestors, my great-great-grandfathers saw in, say, present-day Armidale, where he had a farm. The landscape he saw there would have been a much more open landscape with big old marri and jarrah trees, but also with a lot more room to move in the understory.
Some of the, I guess there are elements of what you talk about in terms of what was there as opposed to what is now, are kind of sad. I mean, for example, you talk about the size of the jarrah trees that were around the Perth metro area initially, and there is a picture in the book of one of those trees. And also the example of the salinity, I guess, in the wheat belt is another example. But you've really been quite determined to be positive in the way that you've portrayed, the potential for this environment, for this unique environment that you're discussing. Why have you decided to do that?
Why have I decided to take a
positive slant?
A positive slant. Part of the book is an environmental history of our home, if we live here in Southwest Australia. And yes, so part of that story is a story of wounds and violence that humans, and particularly colonial humans, have inflicted on our landscape. I think at some point in my writing of the book, I thought maybe I should call it Calling Back the Swans, because the last few chapters talk about the ways in which knowledge of the past isn't just escapist. When I paint these pictures of enormous jarrah patriarchs on the Swan coastal plain, these enormous trees, I'm not just giving some kind of escapist fantasy for people who are sad about this world we've created of tarmac and buildings. it has a future-orientated purpose. If we understand what was there before, we can have a vision for what can be there in the future. And it's not only a matter of understanding, these plants and these animals were distributed across the landscape in these spots. Yes, actually environmental history tells you that. So that's one reason to understand environmental history, if you want to put it back there. So there's a technical and scientific reason to have a detailed understanding of the environmental history of our home. There's another reason which allows us to aspire to bring these plants and these animals into our life as companion animals, garden species, things that we maybe even have in children's books or in other ways, it kind of bring them into our culture, into our stories.
You remind me of that term, kalip. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Kalip.
So there's an old Noongar word, kalip, and it means a knowledge of the bioregion. They wouldn't use the word bioregion, but a knowledge of local landscape. For example, knowing a biddy, a pathway across from here, just next to Kings Park where we're now sitting, to say the coast. They would have had particular routes that they followed past hills and along valleys. These days we have very angular freeways that cut through space and across place, but it means something more than just knowing where the different hills are and the river. It means also having a deep acquaintance with the plants and the animals of the place. And it's something which I think a reading of the book will give you a little bit more of. It's something which the research for the book gave me a whole lot more of.
It's interesting because that was the thing that was really missing when the explorers and the first settlers came to Western Australia. And I love the fact that you talk about how they didn't really look too much further than the banks of the Swan River to see how much arable land there was. So they went back giving quite a different impression of what was available for farming in Western Australia.
So in 1827, James Stirling and his men went up the Swan River in a small boat and investigated prior to beginning white colonisation around here in 1829. And they, interestingly enough, saw the areas of the Swan River that had actually quite seemingly fertile, luxurious vegetation along its banks. Sterling wrote to London talking about the romantic, sinuous river and its luxuriant vegetation here on the Swan. I wouldn't normally describe the Swan Coastal Plain as in those terms, but
how would you describe it?
Well, I mean, often for us, it coming from, look, we are a member of the species Homo sapien. We come from young, fertile landscapes. Here we are in a landscape leached of nutrients. It's not like Andrew Marvell's Stumbling on Melons. He's a poet from the 1600s in England who wrote a poem called The Garden, and it's a typical example of English pastoral poetry where the natural world offers its forward its bounty to humans without any miserly attitude. In Western Australia, there's very few fruit. We have quandongs, not many other examples. It's not a landscape that is particularly benign on the human species. It's a very arid place.
Just because there were plants growing there didn't mean that you could then grow agricultural, food farming wasn't necessarily going to work.
That's right.
I enjoyed your realisation that you'd grown up very close to where your ancestors had actually landed in Fremantle.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my boyhood after primary school down on South Beach making sandcastles with my friends and my dog. And I at some point I remember reading an account of Henry Edward Hall, who's my great grandfather, arriving off South Beach. It wasn't called South Beach at that point, but I checked on the map, on an old colonial map, where exactly he'd landed, and I realised that it was where I used to make sandcastles down at South Beach. And I thought to myself, there's this image in 1830 of one of my ancestors bobbing 100 metres off the shore in a wooden sailing ship full of wooden cages of pigs and sheep, and these 5 dogs running around yapping, and there was I, back in the early 80s making sandcastles within a few metres of where that had taken place. It was a strange juxtaposition of images, and it was an exciting moment. It really gave me a deeper connection with my past.
I imagine it would have. Yeah, it's a really lovely connection to find. I know that one of your, you had a few texts that you really used as a good resource during your research, but one of them is actually your West Australian book recommendation for today, George Fletcher Moore's The Millenden Memoirs?
That's right, yeah. You can get it as The Millenden Memoirs today. You can buy a copy or get it out of the library. I think he called it something more like a diary of 10 eventful years in the Swan River colony, or Swan River settlement. Yeah, so George Fletcher Moore, what a guy. I recommend that, obviously I recommend people read my book, but let's leave that aside. I recommend people read at least a few pages of this. You just jump in at any point. It's a diary written over several years in the early 1830s. And George Fletcher Moore, who was an Irish bachelor and lawyer, and he had a property called Millenden on the Upper Swan, and he spent his time going to dinner parties, sitting in the Legislative Council, writing letters, farming sheep, growing vegetables. Interesting character. When you read his diary, it's not all about the machinations of government or the work of a bureaucrat or farming sheep. You might drop in at a diary entry and find that he's just been to a dinner party in Perth, and a cat has been. I was reading recently again the diaries, and he was at a dinner party in Perth. A cat was playing with something under the table, the little kitten at this dinner party, and he looked under, and it was a large black scorpion that had been tossed against his ankle, and he was a little bit concerned. But or another time, he's going home back to his property in Millenden, and he notices an emu with its baby emus, and he describes how he drops down in his saddle and goes under quietly along the bushes, so he comes within a few meters of the emu mother and the baby emus, and then pops up, and the emu mother's consternated and tries to protect the babies. All of a sudden, the horse wants to chase for some reason the whole bunch of them, and he's trying to restrain the horse. But so George Fletcher Moore gives you these incidental details from a Perth that is totally gone, and that we do well to kind of peep through the window of. Yeah,
sounds similar in many ways to what you've achieved with this book, because it is again one of those books that you can open at any page and find something fascinating to which you could take into a conversation quite easily.
Yeah.
I think you've done really well to bring this book to people like me who do feel this sense of belonging to Western Australia and can really get excited again about the environment in which we live. You've done a great job. Congratulations, and thanks for being with me on Cover to Cover.
Thank you very much.
Because many of our viewers don't have a local bookshop where they can buy the books we feature on the show, we've made a special arrangement with Crow Books in Perth. Call them with your order, mention that you saw the book featured on Cover to Cover, and you'll get the postage free. We've created book club notes for Stepping Off and all the other books we've discussed on this show. You can download them from the For Readers section of Writing WA's website. Join me next month to meet Mohammed Masood Morsi when we discuss his novel 22 Years to Life. Through this story of a deeply devoted couple living in the midst of a political conflict, Morsi asks us to consider what a person bereft of hope might eventually become capable of. Thanks for joining me again this month. Thanks also to everyone who's contacted us with feedback about the show. We love hearing from you. Enjoy reading local, and I look forward to your company next month on Cover to Cover.